Okay, we're going to talk about the old kingdom of Egypt and the starting of it and the founding, and get to the point of actually what caused the downfall of the very first dynasties of Egypt, and which led into the first, what we call the intermediate period. And there are different intermediate periods on it. There's a lot of information here, so I'm just going to get into it. I'm going to try to show you some video thing, even ice cores and some other things. This is going to definitely go into 2 times at least. So whenever this one ends, there will be another video in your top left hand corner, which will be the next selection, and we'll continue from there. In ancient Egyptian history, the Old Kingdom is the period spanning 2686 to 2181 BC. It's also known as the Age of the Pyramids, or the Age of the Pyramid Builders. It's really when all of this happens and comes on. It's known for that as it encompasses the reigns of the great pyramid builders of the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt, and you can see this Sphinx ideology here. Among them are King Senefru, who perfected the art of pyramid building, and the kings Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, who constructed pyramids at the Giza complex. Egypt attained its first sustained peak of civilization during the Old Kingdom, the first of 3 so-called kingdom periods, and then it was followed by the Middle Kingdom, which we're not going to really touch upon too much here. God, is it going to do this to me? Yeah, it's going to do this to me. Sorry, people. And during the second period, at the end of that, is whenever the Hyksos had come in, and they say their maximum point was up to here, as they listed as coming out of Nekhen is the last place that they did, but then they retreated back into Avaris and Thebes area, which is what ended up accumulating again and taking them back over. And that Thebes area will come into play here, along with the Memphis area and different places that they had dynasties, for it kind of hopped around a little bit. It wasn't always in one spot. And I've got to mention here too that whenever they talk about this, it almost seems like, oh, and before they were just Ugg, and there was a lot going on before that. But this one seems to mark the high points of civilization in the lower Nile Valley of the New Kingdom, but in the Old Kingdom, it was in both places, and they had things going on all the way up the Nile. A simple look at that would be here, this picture. And you can look at the Nile Delta. And so here's Tanis and Avaris and the ancient city of Buto. Rosetta up here, where the Rosetta Stone was found. Alexandria, which most of it's underwater now, and they found that, been doing diving and so on. And even though they don't show it here, they really owned the Sinai Peninsula and everything at the time. And also, in that other video, which I'm not sure I'm going to be able to show, how much I'm going to be able to show you without being flagged, but they talk about not only is Baharea oasis place that's fervent, but the whole area was savanna at one time all the way down. So when we look at things, we see like the Badari, and there's the Badarian cultures that we looked at, the ancient stuff that we look at, it's pre-dynastic, and the Nakata cultures that run into what we call Dynasty 0 now. And then that leads into the first couple of dynasties when they're really getting things going, and so on. And there's some discrepancy in there and unknown names and stuff like that. And that's right here by Thebes. That's Luxor, right? So you have that, but Hyrcanopolis is up farther from that, Kamomo, and you have the first cataract here at Aswan, way down. And before that is Abu Simbel, Buhin, way down where it makes this hook, and Kerma, and this is a boundary during the middle dynasties here, but before this time they also had people at Napata all the way up through, and then we can see where Meroe is, and Meroe really comes on later. There are pyramids there that are much smaller, but they're really built in a much later date. And we'll take a look at that. And of course, this kingdom of Kush that's known about over here in this Horn area, it seems to relate to the ancient people of Punt in some way, and they had viceroys over it. You can just look up viceroy over Kush, and it'll show you all these Egyptians that were over it during this whole time. So some people have a misconception of what Kush was, and I'll show you some Kushite coins that they found, but it's a rare thing. There really weren't coins going on until much later in most of these societies, by the way, putting another little dating idea onto it. And then there's the Nubian desert, and really Nubia and Nuba meant gold to these people, and this is the golden desert. Out here is the red desert, or Desheret, and it's where we get the word desert from. But they found gold here, and so they used to mine gold. But there also used to be a place right about in here called Nuba in the old days, and there's farming places out there, shrine stuff, and wall graphics and paintings and stuff. And I talked about how on those wall graphics they went around here and found in all of these ripples of mountains that are up in here, and I showed them to you, these people that were going back and forth out of here, and it's showing pre-dynastic situations, them pulling the boats along, things like that, which relates it to the Sumerians and the Sumerian contact. And I've shown a lot of that in some, Egypt's origin series that I did, and so on like that, where simple things like, well, the old seals that are round cylinder seals that the Sumerians used, right? Well, they're found here in the very first place, and a lot of the symbology is found here, and the Gebel Arak knife and Master of Beasts and all these type of things. But also those cylinder seals are really taken from those drills that people are still freaking out about, where they pop out a drill core for a hole, which you can find way back in time in Mycenae, in double doors, right there where that double lion-headed statue's above the temple, or above the entrance. That's another video, another topic. But these cylinder seals, you pop them out of there like that. So here's a cylinder seal. Well, what do they do with these little things? It's like a donut hole. What do you do with it? Well, you eat it. Well, what did they do with them? Well, it looks like they smoothed them down a little bit and then did a reverse bas relief on them, and then they would put them on this clay and roll them out, and they would make a picture. It's an amazing technology, and they're found over here too. But that's really a Sumerian thing, and that's not the topic of this, but just connectives and stuff. Let's see if I can get this in just about right. The concept of an old kingdom is one of three golden ages that was coined in 1845 by German Egyptologist Baron von Bunsen, and its definition would involve significantly throughout the 19th and 20th century on the idea of what we figured out and everything off of Egyptology. Not only was the last king of the early dynastic period related to the first two kings of the Old Kingdom, so it was a continuance of, but the capital of the royal residence remained at Eneb-Hej, or ancient Egyptian name for Memphis. The basic justification for a separation between the two periods is the revolutionary change in architecture accompanied by the effects on Egyptian society, economy, large-scale building projects, etc. So it's like, well, they had it going on, they had this going on, then all of a sudden they built all these pyramids, and that's what we're going to talk about, because you say, well, they built pyramids and everything, and all of a sudden it just goes pow, and everybody tries to put it on a civil war thing, and I've seen so many where they go, well, it just fell apart. The people in Lower Egypt, which is closer to the Delta region, just finally had it, and all these situations go back and forth, and a lot of the things that they found relate to drought. There's a famous, man, I'm going to forget the name of it now. There's a famous scroll which talks about the drought getting so bad that people start starving to death. And then there's an Egyptian tomb that's written through the end part of this that's shown in this other video part. And I'll show you that video, but it's about an hour long. I'm going to try to clip it little bitty pieces here and show you a little pictures mainly because they're going to flag me. But some concepts of it and what they have found. The Old Kingdom is most commonly regarded as the period from the 3rd dynasty through the 6th dynasty. And information from the 4th through the 6th dynasties of Egypt is scarce, and historians regard the history of the area as literally written in stone and largely architectural, in that it is through the monuments and their inscriptions that scholars have been able to construct that history. And people have noted too that Ramses and a lot of people had actually rewritten over other people's things another time and came in and built it up a little more and put up this thing, and then he built it, and it's like, no, most of this was all built. He built a new facade on this part of it, and some other stuff, or rebuilt it, or did things like that. So there's some of that claiming going on, and back at this point they really can't verify much of it, but you can see it coming on in later dates, and they can verify those, and so that's where the discrepancy comes in. Egyptologists also include the Memphite 7th and 8th dynasties in the Old Kingdom, the Memphite area, not the other, as a continuation of this administration centralized at Memphis. While the Old Kingdom was a period of internal security and prosperity, it was followed by a period of disunity and relatively cultural decline, referred to in Egyptologists as the First Intermediate Period. And what are they going to show here? Same picture, but it comes after the end of that, 2181 to 2055. So there's only a couple of hundred years right there that it seems to fall apart again and then get back together, right? At the same time, there's something that drastic that happens that change it, because you were looking at it, and they're building pyramids and this, that, and other, and all of a sudden, wham, bam, going on, and all of a sudden it just goes to crap. And so I'm going to get to it eventually on what caused it, hint to it, and probably give it away early, and then turn around verifying it. So hang with me. During the Old Kingdom, the king of Egypt, they were really kings. It wasn't called a pharaoh until the New Kingdom, and it really means big house. So it's like calling Trump White House in a way. And Pharaoh is where the lighthouse of Alexandria is built, and it's really just a name for that. But he was a living God who ruled absolutely and could demand the services of wealth of his subjects. And this went on from Sumerian people and the representatives of their God, and then it became priests, more like what we think of nowadays. They're in the representation of it, and sacred kings and things like that, but they didn't pull off this God thing. But then a lot of them never looked back, and Gilgamesh and so on, Sargon of Akkad, things like this are looked at as being great men of old, men of renown, if you will. But also they got looked at as being, they got turned into a god on earth. Though it's a Jesus kind of concept, yeah, definitely, and it's way, way back here, and it predates this really. For tribal leaders and everything, we're probably doing something like this, but when it comes on strong like this, it becomes very much larger in scope. But Caesar and all of those were looked at as being a god on earth and worshipped as a god type of thing, right? And that carried all the way through to even the New Testament, and whereas the second coming is Titus and so on. But that's a whole different line of subject talking about and everything else. So let's get back into this ancient age of Egypt, just starting out, right? And under King Djoser, the first king of the 3rd dynasty of the Old Kingdom, the royal capital of Egypt was moved to Memphis, where Djoser established his court, and a new era of building was initiated at Saqqara under his reign. Djoser's architect, Imhotep, which was later coined a god himself for what he brought on with sacred archaeology and sacred geometry and things that went with that, and I'm going to show that coming up in a series. But it's credited with the development of building with stone and with the conception of the new architectural form, the step pyramid. Before this, they were just doing mastabas, and the step pyramid is just a smaller, percentage-wise, on top of, on top of, on top of, very much similar to having them wrapped up as a mummy, wrapped up in their cocoon, put in a coffin, put in a chest, put in a crypt, put in a, and Russian dolling the situation somewhat, but stepped upon each other like a kid doing blocks. And so they're figuring out things of the sacred geometry and things that work, and putting a standpoint on the earth that stands for a long period of time. So if anything dramatic happens, like what had happened way before to them, that they record and others did, that perhaps at least there's enough left there to give more hope to humanity than what they had started with. And that's an important point. Imhotep, though, is accredited with the development of building with stone and with the conception of a new architectural form. Before this, they were using mud bricks, exactly the same size as the Sumerians, and building mastabas and things, and this shows you there was a commonality of it. How much people want to give a commonality to these people that were living around a fertile crescent, and connection has changed a lot. And went back and forth a little bit over my tenure in the study of it itself. Well, they didn't even know they existed, all the way to, wow, they helped form it, to wishy-washy. But of course, when you get back this far, they almost want to go wishy-washy and go and walk off, rather than to try to make enough scientific assumptions to pull off a theory that won't go with their current theory. That's the problem. So they started building these step pyramids at Djoser. The Old Kingdom is perhaps the best known for the large number of pyramids constructed at this time, and huge ones, and also burial places for Egyptian kings, although the Valley of the Kings shows up later and stuff. And this is Djoser at Saqqara, and even though they're refacing this thing, but if you look at right in so that scaffolding and this whole group of people that are doing it, because it's kind of falling apart, rounding off and tumbling down. But what they're really doing right here, real quickly, is covering up the fact that this used to be a mastaba that's really hidden right inside of here. And the mastaba was built upon, and then built upon, and built upon up the levels. And all old pictures show it. And in fact, when it started crumbling apart, it really just kind of like exposed it in some way. So let's go back. The first king, though, was Djoser, sometime between 2691 and 2625 of the Third Dynasty, who ordered the construction of a pyramid, that step pyramid, in Memphis, necropolis, Saqqara, as we call it. An important person during the reign of Djoser was his vizier, Imhotep. So this is like the wizard of old and things, and the guys that knew some things. It was kind of magic and so on. And it was in this era that formerly independent ancient Egyptian states became known as nomes. I know you think of gnomes as dwarfs and things like this, but it's really, nomes is pretty much city-states and little area, like Samaria had with their ones with their separate gods that were majors over gnomes, but they were collective. But it was known as nomes. Under the rule of that king, the former rulers were forced to assume the role of governors or otherwise works in tax collection. So they were pretty much vassals up under them. So you put a major person in, and people were still owning it. People in America get this weird idea. Okay, here's a picture. Civil War never happened. It ended up being separated into North and South. They still got along. Sometimes it broke apart more than others and may have got into civil wars and stuff. But we all decided that there would be somebody that would be a figurehead over both, like Trump or White House. And so he was pretty much over both of them. And then the people that ruled the lowers and uppers, just like now, rule big cities, which is the cities we have nowadays. The size of them is pretty much worth more than this in size and scope and everything. But those people were independent up under a subset of a major ruler. Really a figurehead type, but he had his hands in many things. But you'd be surprised back then what he didn't have his hands in, just like You'd be surprised what presidential presidents don't necessarily have their, if they do it right, they've got it set up to where it runs itself and then there's just interaction. Egyptians in this area worshiped their pharaoh as a living god, believed that he ensured the annual flooding of the Nile that was necessary for their crops. There's all this sentiment to it. Egyptian views on the nature of time during this period held that the universe worked in cycles. We've talked about this a few different times, and that the pharaoh on earth worked to ensure the stability of those cycles. Whether it's a day that dies and symbolically rises again, or a year, and we still have this thing, we celebrate yearly and annual and so on, to certain epochs, to great years, well, through zodiacal ranges, and then through great years and so on. They also perceive themselves as specialty selected people, and you'll see that all through the Aryans that herald civilization all over the place. And your Bible talks about how they had been selected and so on, and it kind of works together. The height of that old kingdom, the Old Kingdom and its royal power, reached a zenith under the 4th dynasty. What do they show here? Sphinx. Which began with Senefru, and after Djoser, Pharaoh Senefru was the next great pyramid builder. He took it to another level. Senefru commissioned the building of not one, but 3 pyramids. The first, called the Medium Pyramid, which is a weirdly stepped pyramid, almost ziggurat-y thing without the thing running up to walk onto the top, right? People have made large notice of this, but others want to just act like, oh, they're playing with blocks. It was named for its location, though, in Egypt, this Medium, but that has a lot to do with other people, too. We've talked about it in other videos. Named for its location in Egypt, Senefru abandoned it after an outside casing fell off the pyramid. People said that there was a earthquake, and there were large earthquakes that were going on at this time, and a whole lot more active than we have now. The only problem is we don't have records of them until it reaches in a time of writing and people writing it down. And the Egyptians, having all of their pride, don't write down things like when they lost a fight or whenever something bad happened. They actually just turn around and write that this king fixed it all up, and you're like, well, what happened? Let's go on. The Medium period was the first one to have an above-ground burial chamber, though. All the other ones are running down into the ground, and it also shows you the Sumerian concept. But using more stones than any other pharaoh, he built 3 pyramids, a now collapsed pyramid in Midian, the bent pyramid. Show us a good picture here. Yeah. So this comes up and then cuts an angle, and everybody says that he made a mistake and then had to change it because it started collapsing. But then why would he finish it off, and then did it collapse when you put the weight on it? No, because they knew special. Okay, well, how about if they knew and they were cutting it at angles for a certain region? I'll show you in sacred geometry whenever we get into that whole idea, how this cuts off at certain angles, and those angles are percentages, and it's kind of like Dungeons and Dragon dice. And they had already figured out 3D representations of geometric patterns, so they were doing a lot of this. Anyhow, and also that's at Deshur, which, see if they'll show it up now. Well, they're just going to show the red pyramid here, and then the red pyramid. Will it show a different picture? Yep. And it looks a lot like the other ones. Here we go, right? At North Deshur. However, the full development of the pyramid style of building was reached not at Saqqara during the building of the Great Pyramids at Giza. Senefru was succeeded by his son Khufu, and that's from 2585 to 2566 BC, who built the Great Pyramid at Giza, and much bigger, and of course they used to be casing stones. Some people believe they were built before that, and all they did was finish it off, that it used to be a step pyramid too, and he finished it off and put casing stones on it, variations on a theme. Not going to go there just yet. After Khufu's death, his son Jedefra, see if they have a decent representation. Yeah, nose kind of chipped here, but you can see his Caucasian features. was an ancient Egyptian king of the 4th dynasty and 2566 to 2558 BC, and Khafre. They're going to show his decent statue. Nah, they show that alabaster looking one. But that's 2558 to 2532 BC, so it's going down. But those last two may have quarreled, and this quarrel apparently ended up in Khafre winning, and the later one built the second pyramid in traditional thinking, and the Sphinx and Giza. Recent examination of evidence has led Egyptologist Vasil Dobrev to propose that the Sphinx had been built by Djedefre as a monument to his father Khufu. Alternatively, the Sphinx has been proposed to be a work of Khafre and Khufu himself. And there's all this stuff about the Sphinx and where it could have been built a lot more. I've gone into a few videos about it. You can tell that the whole head's been rebuilt on it, perhaps before or during the part that they were cutting out the place that's around it. It looks like it would have been built in that situation. There's definitely been a resculpting of the face. People talk about it looking somewhat prognostic, but even major stone builders right off the bat say, well, you've got to cantilever all this weight out there and hold it up. The chin fell off of it a long time ago in the chin beard, and you can see the mass erosion on it, and it shows you there used to be rains. And in that other video part there, they show you the Green Sahara. I'll go into that later a little bit. There were military expeditions into Canaan and deep into Nubia with Egyptian influence reaching up the Nile into what today is now the Sudan. Later kings of the 4th dynasty were King Mokare, 2532 to 2504 BC, who built the smallest pyramid in Giza. So this is the finishing of the Belt of Orion, if you will, and perhaps Djedefre. And do they show you his statue? No, because the ones that they're confused on the depictions that they think are even him. But so there's a picture of Khufu. But this is when they're just developing the whole standpoint of the city, and he's actually wearing just one of the crowns of Egypt, not both. But that's not the topic of today, really. So in this 5th dynasty began with Userkaf and was marked by the growing importance of the cult of the sun god Ra. So this is where this started really coming on. People think, oh, they had it all going on, but no, Osiris doesn't come on until the 5th or so, the end of that and things like that, and they start bringing that on. And this is really deifying some ways the people that had come before them and set forth the people even into the pre-dynastic, some of them, and made it all happen, and deifying them with a name. And they made a bunch of sun temples and in Abu Sir, and so Abu el-Malik. Userkaf was succeeded by his son Sahure, who commanded an expedition to Punt, which is seen to be up in the Horn area. You know, there are Caucasians in the Horn there too. Look up definition of Caucasian race, it'll tell you about it. Sahure was in turn succeeded by Neferkari Kai, or Kakai, and who was Sahure's son. And there's some discrepancy on that, and I don't necessarily want to go into it because it'll take 5 minutes and me having to leave here to show you some things. But there's a discrepancy on who he was because they changed his name and who he had come from. But he's from 2475 to 2455, who was Sahure's son. Neferkari introduced the pronomen in the royal tutelary. He was followed by 2 short-lived kings, his son Neferefre and Shep Sekare. The latter of those two, of uncertain parentage. Shepsekare may have been deposed by Neferkari's brother Dishuini, and they don't show him really, and a long-lived pharaoh who built extensively in Abu Sir and restarted royal activity down in Giza. So there's a hiccup there anyhow in it, but it still happened. And they believe that somebody was a half-brother, and they got it figured out. We'll just put it that way. Last pharaohs of the dynasty were Minkuri Kai, which so he has his other father's name, and this statue's just gone to crap. So it's amazing the other ones we have. But Jedare SA, do they have this? Jedkare? No, just his cartouche. And King Yunus, which is famous for his burial chamber that's been done with an arch ceiling into it. It has all the stars put over it, and it's the first time that they actually put in a whole epitaph type thing, where people later were putting in, the whole Book of the Dead and the whole thing's on the wall. He was start of that. He was the earliest ruler to have the pyramid text inscribed on his pyramid, and there it is on the wall. I mean, literally just encompassing it. And it started a tradition of having the walls covered. Some people would probably say it was gaudy, but Egypt's expanding interest in trade goods such as ebony, incense such as myrrh and frankincense you hear about from the Bible, gold, copper, and other useful metals inspired the ancient Egyptians to build suitable ships for navigation of the open sea. And they act like, oh, well, it came on now, but they show you these ships they've had way before, and I've shown in my videos, shipping goes way back through the last ice age and stuff. We have found in the Isle of Wight a 8,000-year-old boat dock that is huge. It's a huge boat pier. I mean, it takes up a couple of football fields, apparently. I wish they'd come out with a thing that says it. They've just given scant descriptions and showed the little shoreline in this one part, but they didn't even show where it all encompasses. And they said they weren't sure of how big the breadth of it was, but they had found this boat building thing and everything that's going on there. And so that predates this, 6,000 BC versus 2,500. I mean, it's double the idea of already building boats out of wood, planked wood. Yeah. The boats go way, way back, but Egypt's first starting out in their major easy boat was a reed boat, like the Sumerians had reed boats, right? But we all know that the Phoenicians are coming on strong, if not already well in place strong, and being the merchants of old, going around everywhere, starting that linguistics that works off phonics, made from the word Phoenician. We still use it today, including a variation derivative Arabic of their alphabet, but the Greeks and Hebrew and stuff all came from that and out of that. But these people had cuneiform, and that's in Sumeria, all the way up that Fertile Crescent into the Hittites and down through here. And it's the lingua franca all the way through for a long, long time. But that's probably another story altogether. They traded with Lebanon for cedar and traveled the length of the Red Sea to the kingdom of Punt. And a lot of people, I ain't going to show it there, a lot of people say, well, it's all the way down the Red Sea. Is it the Horn area, or is it on the other side where the Sabaeans were, and things like that? And there's discrepancies. I made a video about it, and it lit people all up. So probably where the modern day Somalia is, but that wasn't the culture that was there at the time. For ebony, ivory, and aromatic resins, shipbuilders of that era did not use pegs or tree nails, which comes even before nails, or metal fasteners, but relied on rope to keep their ships assembled. And it's amazing how they have them, all the planks and the superstructure were tightly tied and bound together, and that and just a little bit of bitumen, and you wet that hull and it sweats just a hair, and it'll hold water fantastically. And people look at that nowadays like that sunboat and everything. Yeah, but that's just some symbolic. No, that thing go on the water very well, and short of giant waves, it's doing fine. Is it seaworthy? No, but we can put planks a little more up the side, and all of a sudden we've got a Phoenician trawler, and yeah, it is. And by seaworthy, we mean out the Pillars of Hercules. So here we talk about the decline into the first intermediate period. During the 6th dynasty, the power of the pharaoh gradually weakened in favor of power of nomarchs. I'm going to have to go out on this. See if I can do a These nomarchs are basically regional governors, viceroys, and so basically whenever Kush ends up later doing it, it's a viceroy area that comes back and takes them back over. But they were all back together then ish, and it was starting to fall apart again, by the way, but that's way, way later. I'm talking 25th dynasty, and we're at 6th. So there's a large difference between those, but the people stayed static, and genetics has shown that they did all the way through. We'll get into that shortly in a minute. These no longer belonged to the royal family, and their charge became hereditary. So, thus creating local dynasties largely independent from the central authority of the pharaoh. So they bisected into their nomes more and had it all controlled. So suddenly it became state and city governed, if you will, in our mentality versus letting it all go. You know, the individual state governors were kind of over it and controlling it more city. Everything was still intact in trade and everything, but just weaned over that way, but then it fell apart. We'll talk about it. So, thus creating local dynasties largely independent from the central authority of the pharaoh. However, the Nile flood control was still the subject of very large works, including especially the canal to Lake Moeris around 2300 BC, which was likely also the source of water to the Giza pyramid complex centuries earlier. And this Lake Moeris that they have here, now terrible picture, guys. Anyhow, it's just stuck off the Nile, and it's that blob that you see over. And still to this day, they have that area, and it's green, and so on. In fact, let's go up and tag that. If I zoom way in, here it is. But now Lake Moeris is receded all the way to that little thing there. But it used to be bigger than this green deal, and they had actually redug this out. It started to become where if it didn't flood big, it wouldn't get fresh water into it, and started receding. So it looks like they built a whole canal going to it, and people used to cruise into there, and it was their own little cool spot. And they talked about pyramids being in there in the water in ancient days and all kinds of stuff. But let's go back to this. Lord, sorry. So decline. The internal disorders set in during the incredibly long reign of Pepi, 2278 to 2184. The guy looks like he lived, they say he reigned over 60 years. There's some discrepancy there, but, and here's Pepi. There he was on his lap of his mother. There's a pretty good statue still left of alabaster. You can see the Caucasian features of him too, and we'll get into that in a minute. Towards the end of the dynasty, his death certainly is well past that of his intended heirs, might have created succession struggles. The country slipped into civil wars more decades after the close of Pepi II's reign. And in that video that I would try to show, and we'd be glad to show you pieces of that verify this at certain moments, it goes into it too, and it talks about how, well, by the time that old man died, his kids took over, but his kids were in their 50s and they just started flaking off. So one lived like 8 years and one 12 years longer than that 8. So, oh my God, 20 years longer. Got to be 80 something, I guess, but he flopped. Somebody else got it, and with a couple of years he flopped. And this non-structure right there caused the one group that was holding it all together to falter, and that hiccup threw everything apart. And that's what they want you to believe, and that's the only thing that caused this, right? But they'll tell you that there were droughts and bad things happened and da-da-da. We'll go into that in a minute, for that drought is real important, and the cause of it talks about stuff I talk about sometimes. Man, I wish I could catch that right. So the final blow was the 20th century drought in the region that resulted in a drastic drop in precipitation for at least some years between 2200 and 2150, and this prevented the normal flooding of the Nile. In other words, every year where this place would burp over and put out this new fresh layer of darkened silt, that's why they had the name for it in the first place, of Kemet, black soil, it stopped. It didn't make it. They had to shadoof if they could. They show that Elephantine Island was actually separated in a couple of islands, and then it sunk down to the point where it's like today, and it all met in together, turned into a swamp a little bit, and then it filled in, or they may have helped it somewhat and foundationed it in the middle of it and made it to where, boom. Of course, that got inundated a few times later whenever the Nile really threw in, but they must have thought at this point that it was all going to crap, and that the god Happy wasn't happy anymore. That's the Nile god, and all kinds of crazy things happen. And so they say here, before I get into this, whatever the cause of the collapse of the Old Kingdom was followed by decades of famine and strife. An important inscription in the tomb of Antifi, there you go, and it, during this guy, which was locked in a Theban-based conflict. He was a nomarch during the earliest first intermediate period, so he was under control of one part of it, describes the pitiful state of the country in which famine stalked the land. And it's terrible. And he talks about people starving to death and some people trying to eat their kids and stuff. And it gets way out of hand. So it's not just hiccup. And again, I told you the Egyptians don't write down stuff like this usually. And perhaps after that point, people being able to see that before said, don't write down things like that again. Even if it happens. But it never really happened that bad again. But boy, it got close a couple of times, but that's not for this video either. So let's look at this 22nd century BC drought. 4,500 or 4.2 thousand years ago now, from now. Let's see if I can get in on this. No. Yeah, one of the most severe climatic events of the Holocene epoch, which is, we live in the Holocene now. This is coming out of the last ice age. It defines the beginning of the current Magellanian age in the Holocene, and starting about 2200 BC, radically happening, and it probably lasted through the entire 22nd BC, hypothesized to have caused the collapse of many civilizations, right? And if we just look at this picture here, what's weird is they say, well, these crosshatch ones here are where they show that there was rain going on, but everywhere else is where there is none. And this is all of North Africa, Egypt, and so on. But I think they even talk about it here, and they do in that show too, I believe, in a point, that India had an extreme problem right here. And so really this whole area in drought, and even lost some of its civilizations because rivers dried up totally. And when it came back and caused a flood, that caused a problem. But then it went on drought again, and the river changed courses, and they had to move. It's not really what this video is about, though. So I don't know whether to go through this wholeheartedly, there's old Tut, or to go further of it. But they tell you that art was a defining function of the early dynastic period. This is where certain things are taken and written in stone to keep going on. And we're about to go to part number 2, and so I'm going to start that, coming out of that and going into some of the video and picture presentations of this. Hey, there's a hook to make you go to part 2. And it's going to come up in your top left-hand corner, where we'll talk about Egyptian art. It's very similar to other people's art, but it has their own flair. But in that art, you can see red ochre males and pale females, just like you do in the Minoans and ancient Greek art, and Mitanni and Etruscans, and people all over this area. So, and it has a symbology all of its own to keep the women pale and so on. Anyhow, guys, top left-hand corner. We'll see you there.